They thought she was just another suspicious black woman. They had no idea she was the most powerful lawyer in the state. It was late, past 11, but Monica Jefferson didn't rush. She had spent the entire day in court, moving from one case to another, her mind a constant battlefield of arguments, evidence, and closing statements. Now, all she wanted was to refuel her car and get home. She pulled into a Chevron station in Birmingham, Alabama, letting out a slow breath as the gas pump beeped to life. The warm glow of the overhead lights cast long shadows across the pavement. The quiet hum of the night only broken by the occasional car speeding past on the highway. Monica reached for the gas nozzle, her thoughts elsewhere. Maybe she'd pour herself a glass of wine when she got home. Maybe she'd finally finish that book sitting on her nightstand. She didn't notice the squad car pulling in until the doors slammed shut. 2 officers, one older, broad-shouldered, wearing the kind of authority that demanded obedience. The other younger, eager, watching his partner for cues. Sergeant Greg Matheson and Officer Kyle Barker. She felt their eyes on her before she even turned. That look. The one she had seen play out in courtrooms over and over again. "Ma'am," Matheson called, walking toward her with a purposeful stride. "We're going to need to see some ID." Monica's fingers paused on the pump. She glanced up, already knowing where this was going. "Why?" "Routine check." His voice was clipped, practiced. She studied them for a moment. No one else was at the station. No one else was being questioned. Just her. Monica exhaled slowly and pulled her wallet from her purse. "I'll show you my ID," she said, her voice even. "But first, tell me why you stopped me." Barker stepped forward. "We got a report of a stolen black Lexus in the area. Yours matches the description." Monica almost laughed. She had owned this car for 4 years. The plates were registered in her name, the insurance under her policy. A stolen car. "Who reported it stolen?" she asked. Matheson narrowed his eyes. "Let's not make this difficult." Monica didn't move. She had handled far worse than this. Murder trials, federal corruption cases, criminals with everything to lose. But she knew better than to argue in a situation like this. She handed over her ID, keeping her expression neutral as Matheson took it. Barker circled the car, running a hand over the hood like he was inspecting for evidence. "I need you to step away from the vehicle," Matheson ordered. Monica's patience thinned. "You have my ID? Check it. You'll see this car is mine." Barker stopped at the driver's side door, peering in through the window. "Is that a work bag?" Monica followed his gaze. Her leather briefcase, the same one she carried every day to court, sat on the passenger seat. "Pop the trunk," Matheson said. Monica raised an eyebrow. "No." He stepped closer. "Excuse me. You don't have probable cause," she said calmly. "My ID is valid, and this car is legally mine. You have no right to search it." A flicker of irritation passed over Matheson's face. He turned toward Barker. "Call it in." This was where things got dangerous. Monica had seen it too many times, how quickly situations like this could spiral. She could hear Barker's voice on the radio calling dispatch. Monica's heart pounded, not with fear, but with a sharp, growing frustration. She had worked her entire career to fix this, to hold officers like these accountable, and now, here she was. Matheson folded his arms, watching her like a problem that needed solving. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to step away from the car." Monica didn't move, but she knew this wasn't ending here. "If I refuse?" Matheson's expression darkened. "Then we'll have to do this the hard way." Monica felt the shift in the air the moment Matheson squared his shoulders. His stance changed, more rigid, more aggressive. She had spent enough time in court dissecting police body language to know what was coming next. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask you again," Matheson said, his voice tightening. "Step away from the vehicle." Monica's pulse stayed steady. She had argued against men like him in court, picked apart their excuses on the stand. But here, on this dimly lit gas station lot, there was no judge, no jury, just power unchecked. Barker's hand hovered near his belt. Tension crackled between them. Monica could hear her own heartbeat, steady and deliberate, as she calculated her next move. "Sergeant," she said, her voice calm, measured. "You know this is illegal." Matheson exhaled sharply through his nose. "You're resisting a lawful order. There's nothing lawful about it." Monica countered. She should have known it didn't matter. Barker moved first. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist with a force that told her this wasn't about a traffic stop anymore. This was about control. Before she could react, Matheson grabbed her other arm, wrenching them both behind her back. "Are you serious?" Monica hissed, twisting slightly. "Stop resisting," Barker snapped. She wasn't. But they needed her to be. Cold steel closed around her wrists. The snap of the cuffs locking into place, echoing in the silence. "You have no right." "You're under arrest for failure to comply," Matheson interrupted. Monica clenched her jaw. This was textbook. Get the suspect agitated, escalate the situation, justify force. It was all so predictable. They turned her, pressing her against the side of the car. The rough texture of Barker's gloved hand pushed against her shoulder. "You got anything on you I should know about?" Barker asked, patting down her pockets with deliberate slowness. Monica stared ahead. "Check the purse," Matheson ordered. Barker grabbed it off the hood, yanking it open. Wallet, keys, court badge. His movement slowed. Sarge?" Matheson glanced over. "What?" Barker pulled out a leather case, flipped it open. Monica's official identification stared back at them. State Prosecutor's Office. Chief Prosecutor. For a moment, silence. Then, Matheson snatched it from Barker's hand, eyes scanning the embossed lettering, the golden state seal glinting under the fluorescent lights. His face lost a shade of color. "You're making a mistake," Monica said, her voice calm but edged. Matheson blinked, processing. Barker shifted uncomfortably. "Sarge." "What do we do?" Matheson hesitated. The weight of what they had just done was crashing over him in real time. They had just arrested the woman overseeing their own department's racial profiling investigation. And now, they were trapped. "Take the cuffs off," Matheson muttered. Barker didn't move. "I said, take the damn cuffs off." Barker fumbled, metal scraping against metal as he unlocked them. Monica rubbed her wrists, watching them both carefully. "Look," Matheson started, forcing a tight-lipped smile. This was a misunderstanding, but Monica wasn't smiling. She slowly took back her ID, slipping it into her jacket pocket. "Yeah," she said, eyes locked onto his. "It was. But misunderstandings don't come with handcuffs. And this wasn't over." Monica stood still, her wrists aching from the cuffs, the weight of the moment pressing down on the two men in front of her. Matheson looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff without realizing it. Barker, younger and greener, kept shifting on his feet, his fingers twitching at his sides. "This doesn't have to go anywhere," Matheson said, his voice forced into something resembling control. "Let's just move on." Monica let the words settle. Move on. She had spent her career fighting for people who never got the chance to move on. People who were dragged from their cars, slammed onto pavement, humiliated in front of their families, all because of officers who saw them as a problem, not a person. She inhaled, slow and steady. "You detained me without cause. You handcuffed me. You conducted an unlawful search. And now you want to walk away." Matheson swallowed. "We didn't know who you were." Monica's eyes narrowed. "And if I weren't the chief prosecutor, would we still be having this conversation? Or would I be in the back of your cruiser right now?" Neither of them answered. Barker finally looked up, his face uncertain. "Look, we were just doing our jobs." Monica let out a sharp breath. That excuse. That tired, lazy excuse. She took a step forward, lowering her voice just enough to make them listen. "You think this ends here? You think because you took the cuffs off, this all disappears?" She tilted her head. "Tell me, how long have you been on the force?" Barker hesitated. 5 years. Monica turned to Matheson. "And you?" His jaw clenched. 18. 18 years, she echoed. "Long enough to know better." Matheson exhaled through his nose, his hands resting on his hips like he was bracing himself. "What do you want from us?" Monica studied him. "I want you to remember this moment. Because the next time you pull over someone who looks like me, but doesn't have this..." She held up her badge, letting the weight of it sink in. "They won't have the same power to fight back." She let the silence stretch. Barker shifted again, his face tight, eyes darting between her and his partner. Finally Matheson spoke. "Look, we screwed up. I get it. Monica shook her head. No, you don't. But you will. Matheson opened his mouth, but before he could say anything, the crackle of Barker's radio cut through the air. Unit 27, status check on that traffic stop? The dispatcher. Someone else knew about this encounter now. Barker hesitated, looking at Matheson for guidance. Matheson exhaled sharply. Tell them we're clear. Barker hesitated just a second too long. Guilt is a heavy thing to carry. But eventually he pressed the button. Unit 27, all clear. Monica nodded. Good. Now, I suggest you both go home and think real hard about what just happened. She turned toward her car, reaching for the door handle. But then, as if something had just clicked into place, a slow realization crept into Matheson's face. What department did you say you worked for? He asked carefully. Monica smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I didn't. She slid into her seat, closed the door, and started the engine. As she pulled away, she didn't need to look in the rearview mirror to know they were still standing there, their world suddenly much smaller than it had been 10 minutes ago. Because they had just wrongfully arrested the woman leading the investigation into their department. And tomorrow morning, they would wake up to a nightmare they couldn't walk away from. The next morning, Monica sat at her desk, staring at the stack of case files in front of her. The irony wasn't lost on her. For months, she had been reviewing complaints against officers in the Birmingham Police Department, each one outlining patterns of racial profiling, excessive force, and unlawful stops. Each one filled with names of people who had been humiliated, arrested, or worse, all because officers made a mistake. And now, her own name belonged in one of those files. A knock at the door pulled her out of her thoughts. Her assistant, Clara Rodriguez, poked her head in. They're here. Monica exhaled. Send them in. The door opened wider, and Police Chief Walter Grayson stepped inside. His expression was tight, unreadable. Behind him, Internal Affairs Investigator Samuel Owens carried a manila folder tucked under his arm. They didn't waste time with pleasantries. Grayson cleared his throat. I saw the footage. Monica's fingers tapped against the edge of her desk. The gas station cameras had caught everything. I assume you also saw the part where they put me in handcuffs, she said coolly. Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line. I won't defend them. What happened last night was unacceptable. Monica tilted her head. Then you already know what comes next. Owens set the folder down, flipping it open. Inside were disciplinary reports. Matheson and Barker's names stamped across multiple complaints. Monica glanced down. How many? Grayson hesitated. Monica looked up sharply. How? Many, Owens answered instead. 14 complaints against Matheson, 9 against Barker. Mostly racial bias claims. Monica let that sink in. And yet they were still patrolling the streets. She leaned back in her chair. You know, when I started looking into this department, I had a theory. She folded her hands together. I assumed the problem was systemic, that leadership turned a blind eye. But last night, I realized something else. Grayson's eyes flickered. And what's that? She held his gaze. The problem isn't just the system. It's that officers like Matheson and Barker think they're untouchable. Grayson shifted. I'll be placing both of them on administrative leave. That's not enough. Monica cut in. Owens watched her carefully. What do you want? She leaned forward, her voice firm. I want them off the force. Grayson tensed. Monica, you know how difficult it is to fire an officer with union protections. Even with the footage, the appeals process could drag on for months. Then let's make sure they don't appeal. Grayson exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. You're asking me to throw them to the wolves? Monica's expression didn't change. No. I'm asking you to hold them accountable. For once, Owens shifted in his seat. If we charge them, the department will take a hit. It's already under scrutiny. Monica let out a short laugh. You're worried about the department's image? I was humiliated, handcuffed, and illegally detained by 2 officers with a history of misconduct. If you think I'm letting this go, you don't know me at all. A long silence settled between them. Grayson exhaled. What charges are you recommending? Monica didn't hesitate. Unlawful detainment, misconduct, and abuse of power. Grayson's shoulders sagged. He knew there was no way around this. Fine. Owens nodded. I'll draft the paperwork. Monica stood. And one more thing. They both looked at her. I want a press conference. Grayson frowned. You sure about that? Monica's eyes darkened. I'm done handling things quietly. It's time the public knows exactly who's protecting them. Because if Matheson and Barker could do this to her, a woman with power and influence, what were they doing to people who had no voice at all? This wasn't just about justice. This was about making sure it never happened again. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras clicking every few seconds. The gallery overflowed with spectators, community members, activists, other officers watching the proceedings in silence. At the defendant's table, Sergeant Greg Matheson and Officer Kyle Barker sat in stiff suits, their badges removed, their futures uncertain. Barker looked down at the table, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned white. Matheson, jaw clenched, stared straight ahead, his expression carefully blank. Monica entered, the sound of her heels clicking against the polished floor. She had prosecuted criminals, corrupt officials, even officers before. But this was different. This time, she was both the prosecutor and the victim. She took her seat, setting down her notes. Today wasn't just about these two men. It was about the entire system that had allowed them to operate unchecked. The judge entered, calling the courtroom to order. The proceedings began. The prosecutor, Monica's colleague, Assistant DA Leonard Briggs, stood. Your Honor, the people will show that the defendants, Sergeant Greg Matheson and Officer Kyle Barker, engaged in an unlawful detainment, violated the rights of the victim, and abused their authority under the color of law. Matheson's attorney, Victor Langley, rose next. His voice was smooth, practiced. Your Honor, my clients acted within the scope of their duties. This was a misunderstanding, not an intentional act of misconduct. A misunderstanding. Monica kept her expression neutral. A misunderstanding doesn't come with handcuffs. Briggs called the first witness, the gas station manager. I was inside watching the cameras, the man testified. She was just pumping gas. Then those two showed up, and you could tell right away they weren't there to help. Briggs played the surveillance footage. Every second of the wrongful stop played out on screen. The moment Matheson demanded ID. The moment Barker circled the car. The moment Monica was grabbed, restrained and cuffed. And then, the moment their faces changed when they saw her badge. Briggs let the footage roll a few seconds longer, letting the weight of it settle in the room. Do these officers appear to have any reason for making the arrest? He asked. No, sir, the manager answered. They just wanted to. Matheson shifted in his seat. Barker kept his head down. Next, Barker was called to testify. He hesitated, glancing at Matheson before finally standing and making his way to the witness stand. Briggs leaned forward. Officer Barker, let's talk about that night. When you approached Ms. Jefferson, what did you suspect her of? Barker swallowed. There was a report of a stolen vehicle matching the description. Briggs raised an eyebrow. Did you confirm the report before approaching her? Barker hesitated. Not at that moment. Briggs stepped closer. So you had no actual reason to suspect her? Barker shifted. We, just wanted to be sure. Briggs turned to the jury. Wanted to be sure. That's the reasoning. Not probable cause, not evidence. Just a gut feeling. He turned back to Barker. At what point did you realize you had detained the chief prosecutor of this state? Barker's face reddened. After we ran her ID, and yet you still handcuffed her first. A long pause. Barker finally muttered. Yes, Matheson's attorney objected, but the damage was already done. When it was Monica's turn to take the stand, she spoke clearly, firmly. I have spent my career ensuring that people are treated fairly under the law, she told the court. These officers treated me as a criminal first, a citizen second. The only reason I am standing here today instead of sitting in jail is because of my job title. That should terrify everyone in this room. Her words hung in the air. Matheson's face was stone, but Barker looked smaller, like a man realizing too late that he had ruined his own life. Briggs turned to the jury. The law is clear. These men abused their power. Now, it's time to hold them accountable. And for the first time in their careers, Matheson and Barker weren't the ones in control. The verdict came faster than expected. Monica sat motionless as the jury foreman stood, clearing his throat. "We, the jury, find the defendants guilty on all counts." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Matheson's shoulders tensed, his mask of indifference slipping for the first time. Barker let out a shaky breath, staring at the table as if willing himself to disappear. The judge's gavel struck wood. "Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date. This court is adjourned." The moment the judge left, the room erupted. Cameras flashed, reporters surged forward, voices overlapping. "Ms. Jefferson, do you feel justice was served? Do you think this case will set a precedent? What do you have to say to those who defend these officers?" Monica met the press head-on, stepping in front of the microphones with the same composure she had carried from the moment she was shoved into handcuffs. "Let me be clear," she said, voice steady but firm. "This was never about revenge. This was about accountability." She scanned the sea of cameras. "This case matters because it proves something we already knew. When the system works, bad officers don't walk away unscathed. But it shouldn't take a courtroom, a high-profile trial, or the right job title for someone to get justice." The weight of those words settled over the crowd. Sergeant Matheson and Officer Barker thought they could act without consequence. That belief ends today. She let her gaze sweep across the cameras. "And if there are others wearing a badge who share that mindset, let this be your warning." With that, she stepped back, ignoring the next barrage of questions. Justice had been served. But her work was far from over. Matheson and Barker were officially stripped of their badges. Barker, given his lesser role, received probation and community service. Matheson, with his long history of misconduct, was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. For the first time in his life, he would be on the other side of the law. And yet, the victory felt hollow. Monica sat in her office a week later, staring out the window as the city moved on. For every case like this, how many went unheard? How many people had been stopped, searched, arrested, humiliated, and never got the chance to fight back? She reached for the file sitting on her desk. A new case. Another complaint. Another name added to the list. She exhaled and opened it. Because justice wasn't a single moment. It was a battle, and she wasn't done fighting. What happened to Monica was far too common. But what made this case different was that she had power. Power that most victims don't. What if she had been just another black woman at a gas station? No badge, no influence. Just a person trying to get home. Would those officers have apologized? Would they have let her go? Or would they have justified their actions until she was behind bars? Another statistic, another misunderstanding, swept under the rug. This story isn't just about 2 bad cops losing their jobs. It's about a broken system that lets officers like them thrive in the first place. So ask yourself, how many more are out there? And how many more will it take before real change happens? If you believe in accountability, if you believe justice shouldn't depend on status, share this story. The more people who see it, the harder it becomes to ignore. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more stories that challenge the system and demand the truth, because the fight isn't over. Not yet.